Okay. So let's jump right into some of the definitions of cultures that has been proposed. The first thing we should say is there a measurement of culture? And the answer is no. So when we looked at, remember the goals of psychology, and we looked at description and then prediction and all of those things, because technically it's not measurable, the only place we can define or understand culture is in that description goal. Okay. Um, and so, but these are some of the things that most people who study culture, and when we talk about most people, we're talking about this tends to be a very interdisciplinary endeavor. So we see, especially anthropology, which is a study of groups of people, especially in the past, sociology, psychology, biology, does some studies within culture. These are some of the common themes that they all agree that a culture can be defined by or as. Okay. First of all, culture refers to beliefs, values, behaviors, and material objects that together form a people's way of life. Okay. Um, and so when you think about your own culture, it's all your beliefs, the way you dress, the values you have, and all of those things that kind of form. And this is kind of the important part, okay, is a people's way of life, okay? And so the difficulty behind that is a lot of individuals don't feel like they're influenced by culture. They feel that I'm my own unique individual and I determine my own fate and my own reality. Okay. But when we dig deeper, we find that that's a cultural value. For example, when we look at cultures such as the United States, a good part of Western Europe, there's a propensity for what's known as individualism. Okay, individualism is the value that a person creates their own fate. Okay, that it's because of you and only you that you fail or you succeed. Okay, and that's where you can get a lot of individuals believing, well, culture doesn't um, impact me because I'm an individual. Yet again, that's a cultural value. So that's where the relationship between culture and individuals start to get a little bit complicated. Okay. Cultures determine how we view the world around us, as the example I just provided. And the other important part about culture that most people who study it feel is an important part of it is it's intergenerational. Okay. That culture is something that is passed from one generation to the next. And this then sets up a lot of what we call subcultures or um, of what are known as affinity groups. Okay. So there's individuals who belong to, for example, the LGBT community. Okay. And very much so, it's felt that that is a culture of individuals that have a unique set of cultural identity and expectations. Okay. However, this that not it's not necessarily that something that is generate transmitted from generation to generation. Okay. Um, and this gets into we had a discussion before class about one's identity, which we'll get into further in this group, in this class, I should say, in that we have our social identity, and that's everything that is given to us because of our existence in the world. So our age, our gender, whether we're a student or a teacher, your occupation, brother, sister, all of those things that are provided by our social world. Okay. And those things we tend to believe are culturally transmitted in some way. And that's where the difference between culture and an affinity group like LGBTQ or something like that would fit into. Okay. Cultures include the traditions we inherit and pass on to that next generation. And this is why I kind of like the LGBTQ example, because we have seen generational shifts in attitudes and beliefs about LGBTQ on a cultural level. Okay. Just as an example, it wasn't until the late 1970s that being that was defined as homosexual or gay was taken out of the book that defines mental disorders. Okay, so it's only been since the late 1970s that we haven't seen being gay or being LGBTQ as a form of mental illness. Okay, now there's still parts of our culture that still transmit that attitude and that belief, which then creates a lot of conflict. But from generation to generation, we're seeing more and more of a shift of what would be called culturally normalizing things like being LGBTQ. And that's why I kind of like that example from the beginning. Okay. Um, Culture is also totality of the shared language, knowledge, material objects, and behaviors. Okay. And so this is where culture again starts to get a little bit more complicated, right? Because here in the United States, we say there's an American culture. The United States, in and of itself, is a culture. Okay. However, we don't all always share the same language or the same knowledge base, the same material objects, and a lot of times we don't have the same behaviors. Okay. So what do we do with these, right? And so we see the development. I'll use Taco Bell as an example. We try to acculturate those different languages and different beliefs so that we have a common understanding. Okay. And um, so on the shared language component, it's that we still can communicate even if we're speaking a different language because of the cultural expectations, if that makes sense. Okay. But I should say that when the predominant language dies, that culture dies. And this is one clear thing that anthropology has shown over and over and over is once you lose the primary language, that those people become fragmented and they either are absorbed into another culture or they've lost a culture and have to rebuild again. Okay. Um, and so that's one thing to keep in mind about the importance of language and common language, even when sometimes those have to be transmitted through other means. Okay. All right. So culture and society. So society, on the other hand, when we consider those are the structures and relationships within a culture, and it is created and shared through regularized patterns of social interaction. Okay. So society kind of provides those structures for a culture to exist in. So across cultures, so across cultures, we can have similar societies. Okay. So, for example, here in the United States, if we look at kind of cultural influences here in the United States, we could say that there is a Southwest culture. There's a Pacific Northwest culture. There is, an Eastern culture based on people who have immigrated there, the influences of different groups in those areas. But we all share, and this is why the United States is less of a culture, but more of a society. While we do share some very similarities across the different groups and the different regions in the United States, we all have the same structure society. We all have the same government structures. We have the same education structures. We have the same, all of those things that make it so that we have a broader American culture, but those cultural, the way those cultures are transmitted are different based on different regions you live in the United States, if that makes any sense. Okay. So one of the things that we're going to learn here, or if you took intro to psych or developmental psychology, is that humans are kind of unique among species. Okay. In that we are one of the very, very, very few species that are not born with a fully physically developed brain. Okay. Most species, your dog, your cat, your bird, ants, bees, they are all born with a fully developed brain. Okay. And then they use instinct with the parent or whoever then to learn how to survive within their given environmental context. Okay. Humans, on the other hand, our physical brain, well, our brain continues to grow into our mid 20s, but as far as a fully functional physical brain, it takes the human brain until about the age of 6 to become physically fully developed. Okay. Which means that unlike most species where their brains develop in the warmth, biological nutrition of the mom's womb, humans are mainly developed, our brains mainly develop in the cultural, social world that we exist in. Okay. Which means our brains are adaptive to understanding the world through culture instead of instinct. Okay. Our brains are adaptive to understanding the behaviors and the expectations of our social world rather than our biological instincts. Okay. So we are one of the few that do develop a fully incomplete culture. We're not the only species that does, believe it or not. A lot of our primates around the world develop cultures. There's even some cultures that are being explored with arachnids and whatnot. So we're not the only ones, but we're ones that fully take on the cultural perspective. Okay. So, as mentioned, the concept of culture, which is a shared way of life, must be distinguished from those of national political entities and society, as we talked about earlier. So it's important to kind of keep those entities kind of separate from our cultural view. Okay. And that can be difficult again in cultures like ours that have a dual government parties. It's just two governmental parties, because then you either have to decide, are you going to be a Democrat, a Republican, a liberal, a conservative? Some people try to go the midway and say I'm neither. But the thing that we should note is that it's not about being a liberal or a conservative that creates our culture. It is the combination of those two things. Okay. So if we didn't have liberal views and conservative views, we wouldn't have components of what the United States culture or the American culture is. Okay. And that's an important di to distinguish that those two, even though they seem to have their own culture, actually, it's a combination of the two that create our culture or our more dominant culture. Okay. Um, and as we pointed out, the main reason behind separating societies, modern societies, is that they have multiple cultural perspectives. So we kind of mentioned, the Southwest, Pacific Northwest, Midwest, all have different kind of cultural things, even though there's some general things like individualism and those kinds of things that tend to be part of our broader culture. You can go to each area of the country and get a different, distinct feel or a distinct way of life. Okay. On this planet, our race, so it's believed that we evolved over 253 years ago, or take a few thousand. but the first cities only appeared, that doesn't look right, 12,000 years ago. And so, if you think about this and what it means, is that it means that 95% of human life, we didn't have cities, we didn't have cells, we didn't have Tucson's, we didn't have Phoenixes. Okay. And so, if you think about it, it's only been about 5% of our time together that we've existed within a city-based culture or a communal-based culture. Okay. And it's interesting to kind of think about what does that mean? Okay. And are we getting better or worse? It's a question to ask. But okay, so let's go through though the five components that make up a culture. Okay. First one is our symbols. Um, and a lot of times when we think about symbols, we kind of think about, um, um, I'm trying to think. While here in the United States, you could think of like the flags, right? We have the nation flag, we have the state flag, we have the Tohono Nation flag. Those are all symbols that represent the group that exists there, right? What other symbols can we think about that we usually think about when we think about symbols? For religious groups, so we think about the Catholic religion, the symbol of the cross. Um, Anyway, so, but I think you know what I'm trying to get at here. But the thing is that symbols go well beyond that. For example, a stoplight. Um, is that a cultural symbol or not? Not all countries have stoplights. And in some countries, yellow means different than green. So, another good example, and this goes to things like values, beliefs, and norms. And a topic we'll get to later is things like Mother's Day. Okay. And the reason I bring this up is that in a little while we're going to talk about um, ethnocentrism, which is the belief that your culture or your way of life is the only way of life, and anyone else who's doing different should just do what you're doing. Okay. And the reason I bring up Mother's Day is especially here in the Southwest, there's two Mother's Days because it's not uncommon for people in our region to celebrate the American Mother's Day and the Mexican Mother's Day. Okay. And uh, and those are all symbols for the individuals that I do know celebrate. There's a total different meaning behind the American and the Mexican one, and they celebrate them differently. Okay, because they're symbols. Okay, they're a representation of. And just on the ethnocentrism one is my wife celebrates both, and she went to work and said, "Well, I have two Mother's Days." And stuff like that. And the some of our coworkers didn't get it. They're like, "That's ridiculous to have two Mother's Days. They should just do it on the same day we do ours." And so, but that's an example of what's called ethnocentrism, the belief that your culture should be the one that everyone else follows. We also call that colonialism in other circles. So, but anyways, that's a symbol. Holidays are symbols. Our language, we kind of covered values and beliefs. We talked about individualism. That's a value and a belief that you determine your fate and your success. The counter to individualism, by the way, is collectivism. Okay. Collectivism is the belief that my success is your success and your success is my success. But on the counterpart of that, my failures are your failures and your failures are my failures. Okay. Meaning that it's more of our success and failures are community based. They're not individually based. Okay. And when we go and measure these on the broader culture regions, we see that the Asian countries, China, somewhat Russia, but they're becoming much more individualistic. Japan, Taiwan, all of those countries tend to measure high in collectivism. Okay. Now we're seeing some acculturation in countries like Japan, where it's becoming more and more individualistic. In fact, they're about halfway now. But those are examples of values and beliefs and norms. Um, but I want to stop right here and just mention that not all, for example, Americans are individualistic. Okay. If we look at it on a country base, for example, if we take the whole Americas as a country, Mexico actually measures really high in collectivism, and Canada is kind of in between, and then the United States tends to measure high in individualism. But even within the American culture, even though on the broad level we measure pretty high, there are still pockets and regions of cultures that are highly collectivistic. Okay. So, for example, there's an association between when a state entered the Union and their level of individualism and collectivism. Okay. So, for example, in what was quote unquote the original 13 colonies, right? They actually measure really high in collectivism. Okay. So you were talking the New England states, Maine, Virginia, they tend to be very collective. The one of the highest states in individualism is Utah because it's one of the almost last states to enter the Union. Same with Alaska and Hawaii. Okay. And so something about our time together as a union, I guess, has an influence. But we can also think of other subcultures and whatnot that are more collective than individualistic as well. So I want to complicate it a little bit because I just don't want you to assume, oh, well, that culture is individualistic, that means everyone's individualistic. It gets a little bit more complicated than that. Okay. Um, Other things include, for example, material cultures, including things like technology. So there's a difference between what's known as a material culture versus I can't, I'm just going to say non-material culture for right now. Okay. Material cultures value possession. Okay. They value, for example, here in the United States, we're considered a materialistic culture because we value home ownership, our own car, our own clothes, we collect items. Okay. In non-material cultures, they have much more of a preference for non-material human interaction. Okay. So, for example, countries, especially some areas in Spain and France, they would prefer going to a cafe and drinking coffee with people around and interacting with people rather than working to buy something. Okay. And we find that similarly in countries kind of like Italy and whatnot, where work is more about the opportunity to interact with people than to earn material, if that makes sense. So those are examples of material cultures and technology and how that influences. Okay. So language, we'll hit on this just a little bit, is a system of symbols that allows people to communicate with one another. It can either be written, spoken, or both. And the important part of language is it's a cultural transmission. Okay. Um, and it's important not to ignore all nonverbal aspects. Okay. And as I mentioned, it is believed that once a language dies, the culture dies. Okay. And that is something that we were is a huge movement within especially Native American communities is to reclaim language. Because with that reclamation, we are finding the healthier those communities actually become by not losing their language. Okay. Which kind of emphasizes the importance of having a strong cultural sense of identity in place. Okay. Um, what should we note about culture? I mean, language. Okay. First of all, it is something that it seems like we're innately born to develop. Okay. In fact, as early as I believe it's 4 to 6 weeks of age, an infant will actually start taking on their mother's accent. Um, by the age of 12 months to 24 months, if a child is not exposed to sounds that are unique to other languages, they won't be able to hear them at all. They'll only be able to hear the sounds that are unique to their language that they've been exposed to. Okay. Which is funky because it's kind of interesting because I'll go, I don't speak a word of Spanish. I was never exposed to it as a child. And I'll go with my wife somewhere and they'll start speaking and there'll be these moments of silence. And I'm like, why did everyone get quiet during that time? And she's like, we were talking about, and she'd give me the English version because the sound that is used in the Spanish language is unique to that Spanish language. My brain didn't process that sound. Okay. And so this is also why, especially with a lot of, again, the language reclamation and whatnot, it's argued that we need to start at a young age so that those sounds that are unique to that culture, the accent that is unique to that culture are all developed at that very early age. Okay. So, okay.
Is that all like brain circuitry stuff?
Mhm.
I've heard if you don't like introduce a baby to light and for a while, the babies won't develop sensors to see or interpret like lights or images.
Mhm.
Is that the same concept?
Yep. It's the exact same one. And those neural connections just tend not to be made once that unique period is over. That's also why it's much harder to learn a new language after about the age of 6, because those language neural connections have been made. And that's why a lot of adults who do try to learn another language have a hard time, unless they were exposed to multiple languages as children. They tend to have an easier time learning language. But if you were exposed just to a singular language between the age of 0 to 6, from there on out, it's going to be harder for you to learn a new language, especially as you get older. So, yeah, same idea. All right. So, language and values. So, holds people's perceived world through a cultural lens of language. For example, some examples of how language can play a role is the sport of football. Okay, football has very much a different meaning here in the United States than it does, say, in Europe and in other countries, right? Where it's I think it's called soccer here, right? Who are chimps? Um, uh, what is the effect of having English as a dominant language on the internet? And what is that doing to other cultures, right? How does anyone translate a concept for which there is no equivalent? Okay. Um, so values are culturally defined standards by people's judgments of desirable goodness and beauty. Okay. Values are broad principles that underlie then beliefs, which are specific statements that people hold to be true. Okay. So we may value kindness, but we might have the belief that kindness is um, not providing assistance to a homeless person because they need to learn to get up on their own 2 feet and exist in this world. And so my value of kindness is then interpreted in a belief that people, in order to for people to be happy, they need to find their own path, their own success, and I shouldn't interfere with that. Okay. Or on the other side is kindness is the belief that we should intervene when individuals are having a difficult time, right? And we should provide services and those kinds of things. The same value different beliefs. Okay. And that's in a lot of ways what makes a lot of cultures unique and regional. Okay. Because we all, may all have the same value, but the beliefs that drive those can be very community and locally culturally based, if that makes sense. Okay. So, what are some of the, we've been talking about the American cultures. What are some of them, according to this person named Williams, who spent a lot of time looking at it? Okay. So, these are some of the values that are tended to have been held. Okay. Um, Equal opportunity, achievement and success, material comfort, activity and work, practicality and efficiency, progress, science, democracy and free enterprise, freedom, and you'll notice number 10 here, racism and group superiority. Okay. And this is kind of the uh, conundrum of American culture, right? How can we have equal opportunity, democracy, and free enterprise and freedom if one of our other core values is racism and group superiority? Okay. Which has created, again, a lot of the conflict, I think, is being recognized, especially in our modern time. Okay. Other individuals beyond that add things like education, religiosity, and romantic love. Okay. But some have argued that maybe those should be looked at more as a cultural base because most cultures have an education, religious, and romantic love value. Okay. So those aren't unique to the United States. Okay. Values within a society, again, are frequently inconsistent, so they conflict. So the central values, more intense conflict, as I mentioned, for example, are the value of racism versus equal opportunity. That not all values are complementary of each other. Okay. Um, some economists have wanted to add the notion of free market to the American culture. Um, However, that tends to conflict with values, right? Because we go through ebbs and flows of closing our markets and opening our markets. Okay. Right now, we're going through a phase of trying to close market gaps through tariffs. Okay. Well, how can you have a free market if you have high tariffs? But the argument is that that's creating a free market on the other side of the coin. So again, values and whatnot, is this a value or is this a belief is the argument. Let's see. Okay. So, so culture and society set up norms, which are the values and expectations by which societies guide their behavior and its members. So norms can either be what are called proscriptive or prescriptive. And what I'm talking about norms, I'm talking about things as simple as we get up and we dress and go to school and work. We just don't get up and go. Well, I think some people might, but it's a norm that you dress and you shower and you clean and all those kinds of things. Okay. There's local norms. Okay. For example, I don't think you would find a professor here dressing in a three-piece suit. I just, no. The norm is more casual, right? Um, in New York City, it's strange to own a vehicle and get a driver's license. In back here in the West, it's almost a rite of passage to get the driver's license and drive. Okay. So those are all example of norms. Okay. So formal norms express their values through laws and regulations and can be punished. Informal norms are kind of the ones that are the clothing example. There's nothing preventing a professor from wearing a three-piece suit, but there's this idea that you shouldn't. Okay. Mores and are widely observed and have great moral and social significance. And folkways are norms that govern everyday behavior. So when we talk about mores as cultural norms, um, we can think of things like um, when we come into this classroom, right? Usually the instructor is up front, the students sit at desks, take notes, while the professor sits up and gabs for an hour, right? Um, that would be a more because that's across cultures, okay? Folkways, on the other hand, is the way that those things are carried out. So, for example, more uh, in some universities and colleges, it's a lecture room with over 100 students, right? And it's very lecture based. In others, it's more informal. And for example, you guys could interrupt me at any time you want to, and it wouldn't be considered a violation of what the standard should be in the classroom, right? So those are an example of folkways, okay? And folkways tend to be those things that are taught to us by our family and our community, okay? Let's skip that. We talked about that. Okay, so I think we can, okay, we'll get that. All right. All right. So let's finish up with for today just the types of cultures, and then we'll have culture defined. Um, and then we can move from there. So I want to talk about some different types of cultures that have been identified. This is mainly in the area of sociology that looks at these different types of cultures, but we will see that they will have an influence as we get into deeper topics here in the class. So high culture refers to culture patterns that distinguish a society's elite. Okay. So when we think about our culture, we think about here in the United States, we don't necessarily think of royalty or those kinds of things. We tend to think of either money or popularity, right? So we have our actors and artists, and then we have our millionaires and our billionaires, and we tend to think in our culture that's considered high culture. Okay. Popular culture is designates culture patterns that are widely among a society's population. One thing we should say is that before we move on, just what this point is making is high culture is not inherently superior to popular culture, and that tends to be a misnomer. But what popular culture is, what you'll have popular beverages across the United States, what people consume in one mark of the status as highbrow or lowbrow. Um, for example, a new cultural of victimizations, Americans may be becoming increasingly unwilling to accept personal responsibilities for their failings and misfortunes. Okay. So these are all examples of popular culture and popular cultural movements. Okay. The way I would think about popular culture is just like what we think about it in the world, is it tends to um, change based on what is popular for that time. Okay. So when we think about types of music that tend to dominate the airwaves, right? We can think of, 1950s rock and roll to the difference between that and 1960s and 1970s and up to today, and how we responded to it, okay? And how that influenced our behavior. But we'll get more into popular culture when we get into more social psychology type topics. Subcultures are cultural patterns that are distinguished segments of society's population. They involve not only differences, but also hierarchies. Okay. So subcultures here in the United States, I can think of, again, those regional areas. Okay. We can think of Tana Atham versus Navajo. Those are all two different cultures, subcultures to the broader American culture. Okay. And sometimes they can also have countercultural perspectives. Um, so this refers to cultural patterns that strongly oppose those widely accepted within a society. So I mentioned Tanahatham, I mentioned, did I Navajo? We
Yeah.
could also do Apache. We could do any Native American community can be considered a subculture, okay, because it has its own unique values within it, but it also can be considered a counterculture, okay, because it recognizes things like colonialism, okay. It recognizes things like intersectionalism, such as the intersect between race, gender, and its influence on how people have been treated, okay. Um, so, so my point being is subcultures can be just these unique pockets within it, but a lot of them also hold countercultural perspective. Okay. And again, I'll go back to the LGBTQ example. It strongly started as a counterculture. It really started, especially in the 1950s, 60s, and then well into the 70s, where it really took off as this pushback to the traditional nuclear family, man, woman, two and a half kids, picket fence, those kind of ideas. Okay. But as it's continued, it's now going more from a counterculture to more of a sub accepted subculture. Okay. And that's and that's one way, and we'll talk about how do you change cultures. That is one example that of a counterculture influencing the broader culture over time. Okay. All right. Let me think. Is there anything else I want to hit on here? I think we got them. Okay, and we're gonna hit those later. All right.